Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. As a reminder, all of our webinars are, including this one, will be recorded and added to our website in a couple days following the event. We will also be sending the recording via email to anyone who RSVP'd, and any resources that are shared with us today will also be sent to attendees. My name is Amina Dib, and I'm the Manager of Government and Stakeholder Relations at the Residential Construction Council of Ontario, also known as RESCON. I'm also the Chair of RESCON's CARE Committee. Before we get started, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we are situated on traditional territories and treaty lands, in particular those of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, as well as the Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaty First Nations, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis Nation. As RESCON's office is located in Vaughan, we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live in this territory. And though I am not a person of African descent, I am committed to continually acting in support of and in solidarity with Black communities seeking freedom and reparative justice in light of the history and ongoing legacy of slavery that continues to impact Black communities in Canada. As part of this commitment, I would also like to acknowledge that not all people came to these lands as migrants and settlers. Specifically, I wish to acknowledge those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. In support of RESCON's ongoing efforts to confront anti-Black racism, I pay tribute to those ancestors of African origin and descent. This is the third year in a row RESCON has hosted a webinar in recognition of International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is today, March 31st. This UN-recognized day has its origins back to the apartheid in South Africa, and ever since has acknowledged the injustices and prejudices fueled by racial discrimination taking place every day. At RESCON, we ramped up our DEI efforts in June 2020 in response to incidents of anti-Black racism on construction sites. Since then, we launched the CARE Committee, which brings together developers, labor, government, health and safety professionals, and our training partners to achieve short and long-term goals related to combating racism and discrimination through three core focuses: workplace policies, training and education, and marketing and communications. Since 2020, we've held 6 events, surveyed our membership, launched the BIPOC Youth Advisory Committee, released the BIPOC in Construction social media campaign, undertaken training, and developed policy templates that we continue to encourage our members to incorporate and adapt. This year, we'll be releasing a best practice guide for employers to kickstart or enhance implementation efforts, which we will briefly talk about later this morning. All of these initiatives are crucial as we face a labor shortage. By 2030, the construction industry will need 100,000 workers to keep up pace with demand for housing and infrastructure and to offset retirements from the industry. We must continue to welcome all to the industry, as we can't afford to have a limited talent pool and labor pool. Racism and discrimination have no place in the construction industry and will only serve as barriers to getting more people into jobs in the construction skilled trades. Today, we'll hear from DEI leaders who are helping organizations address racism and discrimination, including Chanel Grenaway from Grenaway and Associates, Shafiq Aziz from Harmony Movement, Geeta Ramdas, and Christopher Grant from EllisDon. Our first speaker is Billy Pang, the MPP for Markham Unionville and Parliamentary Assistant to the Minister of Citizenship and Multiculturalism for Ontario. Billy is a lifelong conservative activist and has been elected into politics for over 8 years. Prior to becoming a member of provincial parliament for Markham Unionville, Mr. Pang was a York Region District School Board trustee for wards 2, 3, and 6. He was driven to represent these students and parents of Markham because, with his 2 children of his own, the quality of Canada's education concerns him personally. Billy ran for provincial parliament to reduce taxes, improve Ontario's curriculum, and generally make life more affordable for Ontarians. As MPP, he first served as parliamentary assistant to the Minister of Heritage, Sport, Tourism, and Culture Industries. Since 2021, Billy serves as the parliamentary assistant to the Minister of Citizenship and Multiculturalism. Billy is passionate about representing and advocating on behalf of Markham Unionville at Queen's Park. He has covered a wide range of issues in the legislature, including GO Transit access, police oversight, lowering hydro rates, mental health support during the pandemic, and small business recovery planning. In April 2021, he introduced a bill that would name the first week of every June Senior Volunteer Appreciation Week in order to recognize the vibrant community of seniors that give back to our province with volunteer work. Billy understands the importance of recognizing those of us who work to make Ontario's community so special. His involvement spans even further than his political experience, as he has served in various community and volunteer positions in various humanitarian organizations throughout Ontario. Billy is determined to serving his community and constituents, as he is passionate about bringing positive changes to a place where he and many others have lived and raised families harmoniously. MPP Pang was unable to make it in person today, as members are back in the House this week at Queen's Park. They shared us a message, which we will play now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Billy Pang, Member of Provincial Parliament for Markham-Unionville, and the Parliamentary Assistant to the Minister of Citizenship and Multiculturalism. I'm honored to deliver these remarks on behalf of myself and the Ministry to all of you participating in the Residential Construction Council of Ontario's webinar, in recognition of the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Today, we acknowledge the progress that has been made in creating a more inclusive Ontario, while recognizing that there is still work to do. Our government understands the importance of ensuring all Ontarians are set up for success, regardless of their race, religion, or background. That is why we are working right across government to find initiative solutions that will help eliminate barriers and uplift communities, so everyone can reach their own full potential. Within the Ministry of Citizenship and Multiculturalism, we have several initiatives in place designed to help foster a more inclusive Ontario where everyone can be successful. One such initiative is the Enhanced Black Youth Action Plan. This $60 million investment over 4 years will support the academic, economic, and social development for over 10,800 Black children and young adults through skills development, networking, and work placements. Our ministry is also investing $5 million to support the growth and development of Black, Indigenous, and other racialized entrepreneurs, providing program recipients with training, mentorship, and financial assistance to help launch and grow their businesses. We are taking a cross-government approach to building a more inclusive Ontario, one that extends beyond the Ministry of Citizenship and Multiculturalism. Under the leadership of the Minister of Labour, our government is helping underrepresented workers find significant career growth as part of the Skill Development Fund. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Education has ended streaming, which disproportionately impacts Black students. But we are also making crucial investments to help students succeed in and beyond the classroom. These are just some of the many ways in which our government is finding new, effective ways to empower diverse communities, while building a stronger, more inclusive Ontario, one that is free from barriers and where all Ontarians are set up for success. Thank you, and enjoy today's programming.
Thank you very much, MPP Pang, for your message and for participating in our webinar today. We're looking forward to continuing work with the government on all the key DEI files. We've seen this government do a lot on DEI, so we're very happy to be partnering with them on several different files with them. So before I introduce our next speaker, I want to quickly talk to you about our upcoming best practice guide that Amina had briefly mentioned in the opening remarks. After working with the RESCON CARE Committee for almost 2 years, we've collected many resources and we've promoted several different programs to the industry to either kickstart their DEI work or to just, complement everything that they have. But what we've found is that a lot of these resources aren't being used to their best potential, because none of them really highlight how to effectively implement or to communicate the policies or the points of actions that they entail. So we've spoken to a lot of builders that are working on their DEI, but they're saying we have all these resources, but we don't really know how to do it properly on site. So, and the last thing that we want is for industry employers to be putting a lot of effort in their recruitment and retention and in their DI in general to not have it work effectively. So after consulting with several builders and their health and safety representatives, we've created a short guide made of research best practices. And these are just simply a few steps to keep in mind for better results with your DI efforts. We've intentionally made it a short 3 to 4 page guide, and we've kept it that way, and as we handpicked every best practice tip that's in there. And we've made sure to get input from health and safety representatives and other people that just work on site, because we do want to make sure that it is applicable. So the goal is just to make DI resources used to their best potential, and then also to support small businesses that don't have a lot of resources to kind of do all that DI work. So it just supports them without overwhelming them, because a lot of the other resources can be long pages and they don't know where to begin. So this kind of takes them into the first step of DI. And then for the bigger builders that are doing a lot more on DI, it just complements what they do. So it's a force structure guide, and it kind of just walks through beginning, like building your DEI plan, how to communicate certain policies on site, how to make sure you're capable of discussing contentious topics. And then also, as I mentioned, we made sure that this is applicable on site. And that's why we continuously work with the health and safety reps on site to make sure they say, yes, we can do this and this makes sense. So we'll be sharing more information about it very soon. It's still being reviewed and it should be ready hopefully by the end of the summer, but we're very, very excited to share it because we've been working on it for a while. So stay tuned for it. And then now moving on to our next speaker. Earlier in February, Amin and I were invited by the LIUNA 183 Center to take their DI training. It was a really, really good training, and we were happy to see that the union is hosting it for everybody that's in there. The speaker that we met there, his name was Shafiq Aziz. He's from the Harmony movement, and we thought that he did a really, really good job running the session. We had to make sure to bring him on to one of our events. So unfortunately, Shafiq right now is in the middle of class, but he will be joining us in exactly 2 minutes at 10:20. But he's currently doing one of his classes for his students. And he is, oh, sorry, he's calling me right now, just probably trying to get in. One second.
Yeah, and just to add more promotion to our best practice guide. So that'll hopefully be released in the summer, and we'll be doing sending out to anyone who's attended today's event or past DE&I events. We'll make sure that it also gets to you all, and hopefully that we can get some support in sharing our message and sharing the guide, because again, it is, while it's intended for smaller employers, so people in groups who don't really know where to start with DE&I, it is also can be used by bigger companies and groups that are kind of already well ahead in DE&I, but maybe need to kind of retool what they're doing or kind of do measure where they're at, and maybe they can, I think we all know that like it's a never ending process, and DE&I efforts don't start and stop. It's very ongoing, and certainly it can always be improved. So we'll make sure to get all that information out to attendees when the guide is released.
Very sorry for this technical hiccup. Shafiq will be joining us very shortly. Do we want to move on? Maybe just introduce the other speakers, Amina?
Sure.
Okay, we'll turn it over to Chanel Grenaway.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Really happy to be here and thrilled with the attendance and the participant numbers. I think everywhere I go in all the spaces I visit, I hear that people are busy, some feel overwhelmed. So the fact that you've taken time out today to pause and to acknowledge this International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, I think is really telling, and I totally appreciate it. So yeah, my name is Chanel Grenaway, and I'm a consultant in the area of racial equity and gender equity and diversity. I work with small to medium-sized organizations, a lot of it in the nonprofit sector, but some also in the private sector, to help organizations move from a situation of sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's working in a status quo way, working in autopilot, to a situation of increased awareness related to gender equity, anti-Black racism, and so awareness, and then to action. So that's pretty much my program model, starting where the organization is at, assessing their existing capacity, because we all have strengths in this area and experiences, and then again, helping leaders, staff, frontline team to move through that process to action. So I totally really appreciate the work of RESCON, excited about the best practice guide. I think that's a key piece that I'm seeing that's missing in terms of, we have resources, but what's the how-to? So your support of getting organizations to the how-to, I think, is really important. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Geeta and Christopher, if you just want to introduce yourself briefly.
Thank you so much again for having us. It's so great to continue the conversation, and great presentation this far, and happy to sit amongst all these great panelists. Hi, my name is Geeta Ramdas. I'm the Director of Insurance with EllisDon. I've been with EllisDon for 8 years and currently the chair of Allied. Allied is our employee-based diversity and inclusion organization, amongst many other organizations at EllisDon, and Christopher will talk about the one that he's chairing. So the basis of Allied this year, the mission is education. I think it's very important to educate as we move forward with any of the movements. It's really to get everyone on the same platform and understanding what is the need, what's driving it, where we are at, what is the right terms, what behavior changes. And then again, the call to action is the 1%, just to do 1% better each day at targeting discrimination across all groups. So Allied is currently doing outreach programs, education, and we do a wide range of different groups. And I'll pass it over to Christopher.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Geeta. My name is Christopher Grant. I'm a senior project manager with EllisDon. I've been with EllisDon for 9 years now. I am a co-chair of ED-BY, which is an employee-led leadership group focused on taking concrete action to combat anti-Black racism within the industry. Our goal this year is to put together a formal document in regards to a strategy guide for dismantling anti-Black racism within EllisDon and establish that as a formal policy / initiative. With that said, I don't pretend to be an expert in the field, but I have experienced racism within the industry myself. And I truly believe that if I can make a difference in one individual's life within this industry, I've done my job.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Christopher and Geeta, for being with us, and Chanel. So Shafiq is here finally. So sorry about that hiccup again, everybody. So I'll turn it over to Shafiq right now.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for bearing with the technical difficulties. I'm happy to be here with you all. I'm just going to ask if I can have screen share capabilities so I can pull up some of my slides, Sahad. Thank you so much.
Done.
So I'm joining you all today from an organization called Harmony. Movement. And while I get my slides pulled up here, I'll tell you a little bit more about my organization. So what we do at Harmony Movement, we work towards supporting, identifying, and challenging issues that might exist in terms of barriers to inclusion. The main work that we do focuses on trying to ensure that every community, every workplace has the ability to be able to address issues of discrimination, of exclusion, of ensuring that people who are represented in the workforce are able to adequately access services, to be able to understand what are some of those barriers that continue to exist. And at the core of the work that Harmony Movement does is the idea that, you know, we all have the ability to be able to make positive changes to our setting. So for each one of us, there might be a different set of circumstances, and we know that, you know, throughout working in unique different situations, that there's always going to be unique issues and circumstances to work through. But essentially what we are working on is to be able to identify those issues. And we really believe that with the existing resources we do have available, that there is a lot of opportunity to be able to work towards addressing these issues. So I'm happy to join you here on the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And I'm really hoping to spend the next 15 to 20 minutes or so trying to think about and discuss what are the opportunities for us to be able to work towards incorporating those personal changes so that they can start to have a wider effect within our workplaces, within our communities, and institutionally across sectors. So, in terms of getting started off, and I'm sure you probably did a land acknowledgement, but I think it's important for us to just regularly ensure that we are recognizing the land that we're on. And, in terms of where I'm located on the lands of the Haudenosaunee peoples, the Anishinaabe peoples, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. And one of those aspects that I always think is very significant when we're talking about diversity is not only to acknowledge the nations and the lands of which nations we are on, but also to think about the concepts, the ideas, the frameworks, and the systems in which they lived and had their society structured around. So one of those systems was called, wampums. And as you can see here, this image is the dish with one spoon wampum belt. It was created through community members, salvaging shells and being able to create these wampum belts. Oftentimes was a process that took years, so they were quite significant. But the meaning behind this wampum belt is an agreement, is a treaty amongst various nations that exists in the region of where I am located in the Greater Toronto area. And this dish with one spoon agreement basically says that we are all able to come together and share our resources, be able to share and live in harmony with one another, and to ensure that we are living off the land in a way that is respecting nature. So with the dish with one spoon agreement, the idea is that the land gives us everything that we may need. And although we don't own the land, we all belong to the land. And so when we are on that land, which is represented by the dish, we will take only what we need for ourselves. And because there is one dish and there's one spoon, we're also going to ensure that we leave something for everybody else. And finally, we're going to make sure that we are tending to nature, we're following the laws and principles of the environment around us, and we're keeping our plate clean while we're doing so. So it's with that spirit that we often start off a lot of our conversations at Harmony Movement. And, when we talk about this concept of diversity, I think this dish with one spoon agreement is oftentimes a very useful framework for us. Now, we know diversity has so many different meanings. It has so many different applications, but at the core of it, diversity essentially refers to all the ways in which we are different. And, when we think about diversity, and of course, it is significant to understand race and nationality and ancestry and ethnicity and skin color. But of course, we know that diversity doesn't begin and end with race. Of course, there's many other ways in which people might be different from one another. A few examples on the slide here. Our gender and our gender identity and how we express that, our sexual orientation, whether or not we have disabilities, and considering not only physical disabilities but also perhaps developmental and learning disabilities, our appearance, our citizenship status, our family status, and so on and so forth. So at the core of understanding why it's important for us to continue to talk about diversity as often as possible is because we all have identities that affect how we experience the world on a day-to-day basis. And so what we're going to be focusing on today is that personal lens. It's to think about how do we see the world through our own personal lenses. What are some aspects that have influenced the ways in which we have come to know and interact with others on a day-to-day basis? Now, there's many different ways for us to consider how this plays out, right? And what I'm going to put up on the screen here, a lot of you might have seen before in some shape or form in the past. But essentially, we're thinking about, honoring and understanding all the different influences that might have contributed to who we are. Now, some things might stand out to you in terms of what's on the slide here. Others might be new to you. And even this is just a very short, minimal list. But when we're considering what it means in terms of diversity, we understand and we relate to the fact that diversity is complex, because each one of us are complex individuals. And even though we might be a member of multiple different communities and have people and relationships within those communities that we connect to often, it doesn't necessarily mean that just because I'm part of one particular race that I have a shared experience with all other members of my race. And this is where we come into the term of what's called intersectionality, right? So as we can see, each one of these identities is represented by a colored sphere. And in the center, these spheres intersect. So, for example, I said, I identify as a man, and just kept it at that. It'd be kind of a funny statement, right? We know that there's so many things that have shaped and influenced us in our lives. And I'm just going to spend a moment here to consider, what does that intersectionality mean? And I'm going to use myself as a point of comparison. So, for example, me and my sister. So we both grew up in the same household. We both had the same mother and father. We both, as a result, come from the same national background, have similar traditions and ancestry, and so on and so forth. And we lived together until, basically the end of high school. So we grew up together all of our lives. Now, considering that, right, we think about the fact that we had the same socioeconomic status and access to resources. We had a similar faith and religion and spirituality background. Our families had the same citizenship status. Both my sister and I were born here. Our families came here as refugees. We spoke the same languages, both Farsi and English, and came from the same cultures and ethnic backgrounds and racial identities, right? So you can see there's so much overlap there. But just one part of our identity, just our gender expression, for example, our gender identity, was different. And as a result of that, the way in which we were affected by and interacted with all other parts of our identity was very different. My sister identifying as a woman, myself identifying as a man. We had many, many different cultural influences as a result of those gender identities. So this is where intersectionality really comes into play, into considering why it's important for us to think about and understand the complexity of our identities. We can make our understanding of diversity really simple. And honestly, it's kind of like you make it complicated and then you come back to the same points, right? We're all different, but there's things that make us the same. But at the same time, we also have to be able to balance those two, right? There's the simplicity of understanding those differences, and there's the complexity that exists all alongside those differences. So when we're considering how we're going to be able to appreciate that, and what kind of effect that might have on our understanding of these concepts, today we're going to be spending some time talking about biases. And with the time that I have remaining, I want us to just kind of consider how we can start to work towards making social change. Now, today being the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, of course, is a day to honor and to remember that those changes continue. There's a need for those changes that continues to this very day, right? And although we've made a lot of strides and had a lot of progress in terms of legal frameworks, for example, throughout the 20th century, and we continue to do so in the last couple decades of the 21st century, there still is a lot more work that needs to happen. And although that systemic change has been incredibly significant and has really made a big impact, we know that at the communal level and at the personal level, that we need to continue to strive to incorporate some of these changes, to make these improvements, to push ourselves past our current comfort zone, and to ensure that we're always learning and expanding our understanding of these concepts. So today, I really want us to focus both on the communal, but really intentionally focusing on making change at that personal level. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have already kind of thought about biases. You might have attended a conversation or a workshop or something that's referred to these concepts in the past. And so it really gives us an opportunity not to just learn something from scratch or from brand new, or maybe that is where you're starting off and that's completely fine. But if you have had some familiarity, if most of us have had some time to think about, what are some preferences that I have, it's always a good practice for us to come back to these ideas as regularly, as often as we can, because the more familiar we are with them, the more we're able to start to incorporate these changes into our daily lives. And when we make change at the personal level, we're really talking about how our individual actions can have a big impact on the people that we're most closely connected to. And this is something that I often share, especially within like a workplace kind of setting. If you think about it, a lot of us, if we're excluding the sleeping hours of nighttime, a lot of us spend more time with our coworkers than our own family members. And so when we consider all that time that we do spend together in these kinds of settings, we realize that we can actually have a really significant influence on one another, right? We can boil it down to 40 hours a week, but really comes down to the fact that you see those people almost every single day. And so when we think about making those changes at the personal level, it really serves as a point of motivation, as a model, as an example for others to learn from observing you, to learn from interactions with you, to think about how you continuing this as a practice will then be able to branch out and influence, not only yourself, but also people within your workplace setting and further beyond. So as individuals, we really have a significant opportunity and the power to influence and shape our own lives and have that influence others as well. So we're going to talk about biases, but I don't want to just give you all some definitions. We're going to do a little activity or a little exercise. So I'm going to give you all a second right now, but if you can get out a sheet of paper and a pen, or maybe you can use your phone to write some things down, or if you're on a laptop, feel free to open up a notepad or a Google Doc or something like that. We're going to do a word association. I'm going to give you 10 different types of groups of people. And in a minute, you're going to write down the first word or the first couple words that come to mind when I share this identity category, this background, this group. Now, one thing that's really important, obviously we're doing this virtually, so nobody's going to see your answers, right? You don't have to share with the group. The point really is to not filter yourself. Okay, so let's make sure that we write down the very first things that comes to mind, not the second thing, not the third, not the fourth, not what we think sounds nice, but just the very first thing that comes to mind. And I'm going to move fairly quickly to be able to ensure that we don't have too much time to edit ourselves. Okay, so let's get started off here. So write down the first word or phrase that comes to mind when you think about fat people. And I'm going to give us just about 5 seconds or so on each slide before I move on. Okay, so if we're ready, we're going to move on to slide number 2. The first word or phrase that comes to mind when you think about wheelchair users. Female construction workers. Black people. Transgender people. People on welfare. Skinny people. White people. Muslim people. And our final group, people who are often late. So as we're going through these words, I'm just going to go back and we're going to quickly scale through. And I want you to read through your list as I'm going back and seeing these groups and these categories of people. Okay, so I want everybody to just look at their lists of what they wrote down, and I'll just read out the categories quickly to just see what you wrote for each one. So number 1 was fat people. Number 2 was wheelchair users. Number 3, female construction workers. Number 4, Black people. Number 5, transgender people. Number 6, people on welfare. Number 7, skinny people. Number 8, white people. 9, Muslim people. And finally, number 10, people who are often late. So some observations, some thoughts. Think about it. Was it difficult for you to write down these words? Did you find yourself trying to censor yourself at times? Did anybody notice that they might have written something down that they don't necessarily agree with, or if they had to think about it for even just a few more seconds, they might have said, well, that's not how I think about those people. Did anybody find they left some of those categories blank? Right. So there's all of these different kinds of understandings and reactions. And oftentimes when we are forced to kind of move quickly, we don't filter ourselves. Now, there's a significant piece there around our understanding of biases, right? Because when we think about biases, oftentimes they're unconscious, right? We don't sit and analyze every single new person that we meet for a long period of time. Unless, of course, we have the time and opportunity to do so. But usually when you see somebody, within a split second, you start to kind of guess and categorize and think about who they are, right? Like even as I joined the call, you probably started to guess, like, how old is this person? Maybe you looked at my face or my name and said, you know, what's this person's racial background or ethnic background, right? You know, so on and so forth. And these kinds of things don't necessarily make us. They don't make us bad people at all, right? It's just a way that our brain works. And so this is what we think about when we think about unconscious biases. There are assumptions, beliefs, or attitudes that we have towards groups of people or individuals that affect how we view them and how we interact with them. And if we don't consciously observe our biases, they will remain unconscious, which means that if we do have a bias that is a negative bias, one that makes us avoid certain types of groups of people, then that also is going to mean, as a result, that we are not able to challenge that view. And so with that, I want us to really, be encouraged to consider and think about how we can work towards challenging these biases. Now, biases, they happen in a few different ways, right? It's how we're socialized growing up, how our caregivers and people in our inner circles have acted. Of course, social media and media in general has a really big effect and many more, right? And, biases can affect us in so many different ways. It could be influencing who we choose to be friends with, who we sit next to on TTC or public transit, right? When you get on top of on a bus, you're not going to be sitting around scanning for like a minute or two to try to think, oh, is that person okay to sit beside? Is that not easy to sit beside that person? Maybe they'll chat my ear off. Maybe they'll leave me alone, right? We're making these decisions within a split second. Even who we find to be trustworthy, who we offer help to, right? And I noticed for me, this is something that I oftentimes experience while I'm driving, right? Who I offer help to. I talk about these concepts. I share these things in my presentations. I try to encourage people to challenge their biases, but you know what? I still have my own biases as well. And I continue to work through them because it's a practice. It's ongoing. Nobody is perfect and nobody is free of biases. No matter how intent you are on focusing on these topics, there's going to be new ones that pop up throughout your life. And I find one that I've been dealing with more recently while I'm driving is the one of who I offer help to, or who I'm inclined to offer help to. So oftentimes on the side of the road, it doesn't always happen, but I live in Toronto. It's a busy city. So sometimes you'll see somebody on the side of the road, their car's stranded or they're broken down or something along those lines. And I find myself, anytime I see, if it's a person that's by themselves and it's a woman, doesn't really matter her age, but if it's a woman, then I'm usually, if I'm able to incline, I usually try to stop and help that person out. Now, obviously, it's a nice thing to be able to help somebody, but in that same kind of situation, if I see somebody on the side of the road, they're by themselves and they don't seem to have a car that's working. If it's a man in that same situation, oftentimes I just think to myself, buddy will figure it out. He'll be okay. He'll be fine, right? He probably knows how to change a tire just like I do, right? Now that's a bit of a simple example, right? It's something to say, you know, it's not so bad. I'm not going and you know, berating anybody or being aggressive or treating them in a poor way, but it does show you how that bias prevents certain people from getting my help because I feel like they don't need it, right? And so on that basis, even in that situation, it means that I'm missing out on many opportunities if I have the ability to do so to help others out, right? And thinking about that, there's so many different ways that our biases affect us. So the most significant thing in terms of you know, a few steps that we can take is, first of all, to acknowledge that we have biases. So I want everybody to just take a second right now, just kind of clear our thoughts, and to appreciate and to embrace and understand that we all have biases. So I want everybody to tell themselves, and we're all muted, so we can't hear each other, but you can at least hear yourself. Tell yourself, I have biases and it's okay. I have biases and I'm going to work on changing them. I have biases, but I can always do better. So once we appreciate that, we know that we're not coming at ourselves from a place of harsh judgment or putting ourselves down, but really we're trying to encourage that growth and that development over time. So step number one is to acknowledge the biases that we do have, to observe ourselves in those moments in which we might see certain biases or decisions being made that affect our decisions, to be mindful of our words and actions at those points in time, to challenge those snap judgments, and to continually and regularly question ourselves as we're doing so. And if we continue to develop that as a practice, and this is the last point that I'll end off with before we go to our panel conversation, we are really working towards that aspect of allyship. So an ally is somebody who takes action, who develops this as a practice, who regularly incorporates this on a day-to-day basis. Not just on special days like today, not just when we have an equity meeting or an HR meeting that needs to be discussed, you know, when these issues are brought up, but every single day, right? And that might seem like a lot at first, but just like, you know, exercising or lifting weights, right? At first that, you know, 5-pound dumbbell might seem heavy to you, but if you keep on lifting it up, if you keep on exercising, eventually that's going to feel pretty weightless, right? So an ally is somebody who takes that action. They actively disrupt instances of discrimination when they observe them happening. They listen to members of the communities that they want to support, even if they're part of those communities themselves. They learn from those with those experiences, those lived experiences, and educate themselves as often as they can. And finally, an ally is somebody who yearns for a more inclusive society. So I'm going to leave my section of the conversation there. If you did want to get in touch with me specifically, my email is on the screen, but I'm going to stop my share here so we can move to our next part of our agenda. So thank you, folks.
Thanks, Shafiq. Everyone already, all the other panelists already introduced themselves, so we're just going to go right ahead into the panel. And I'll make sure that everyone's up on the screen. So we have Chanel Grenaway, Christopher Grant, Shafiq Aziz, and Geeta Ramdas. And so my first question, and I'll start with, maybe I'll start with Shafiq since he's still on the mic. But you said it, that we all have biases. And I think like a lot of the work that we're all doing collectively, it's not always easy to tell people that they have biases because no one wants to be told that they have biases and maybe those biases are discriminatory or racist in nature, or are prejudiced. So how do we get over that that hurdle between acknowledging that everyone does have biases or kind of convincing people that, like, again, we all have biases and they're okay as long as we acknowledge it and try and overcome them? How do you communicate that?
Well, I think the foundation is, as a first step, to engage in these conversations whenever you have the opportunity to do so, right? If you only bring them up when, you know, there's an injury that happened to somebody, right? Somebody felt like they were excluded or singled out in some way, and now we're starting that conversation, the feeling is always going to be tense, right? So if we develop this as a practice, we're proactive about engaging these conversations, and whenever we do so, it doesn't feel like, you know, we're having to address a specific issue or repair a certain harm, but really we're just trying to work towards addressing, you know, getting better overall. The other thing is, we really have to get over that self-judgment, right? I mean, it's so significant in our society, and nowadays, like especially within professional settings, it's really difficult to be able to be open and honest about these things at times because of, you know, what we might refer to in a few different ways, but essentially cancel culture, right? And this is the thing, right? If we come out and express, hey, I do have these challenges, or I kind of struggle interacting with members of this group or this community, right? It oftentimes ends up being that we face harsh judgment. So I feel like it's important for us to create environments in which we can be engaging in constructive conversations, but that will never happen until you admit to yourself that it's okay that you have these ideas. And this is why, you know, every time I engage in conversations through my capacity at Harmony Movement, I put myself in the center of that as well, right? And I'm not to say that, you know, I'm perfect, I'm an expert, I've been thinking about these for a long time, but, you know, there is some work and some years that I've spent in this field. And it doesn't mean that just because I've been engaging in these pieces, I've read these books, I've had these degrees in university, I've facilitated these workshops, whatever it might be, it doesn't mean that now I've got it down pat and I don't have to work on things anymore, right? We all have a duty, we all have a responsibility. We need to get over our own harsh critiques of ourselves. We need to get over our own hangups. Only when we do that can we start to do the work of creating those personal changes. And without that acknowledgement, I truly believe that not a lot of progress can be made.
And Chanel, you work with a lot of businesses and organizations. I don't know if you want to add anything there, just in what you've experienced and the groups and people that you've spoken to on that.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. And Shafiq, thanks so much for your presentation and setting the stage for this conversation. Really great. I appreciate it. You know, it's like you said, I'm still learning, and I learn in every space. So in addition to, you know, people feeling that either guilt or shame around this, and not wanting to really explore their, what I would call unexamined bias, which is another way of saying unconscious bias. Sometimes I also hear stories about people in power. So again, be it white heterosexual males, now they feel attacked, and now they feel like they're the bad person, and that can be a barrier in terms of engagement. And so what I say to that is, you know, we're not asking you to apologize for, again, the creation of the system of slavery, the system of colonization. What we are asking you to do, though, is increase your awareness, again, examine your the biases, the system that we all grew up in, and then become accountable, because you do have the power and privilege to make change and to be allies. So sometimes framing it that way, in that, you know, yes, this is the system we're all living in, you know, you're not, you know, yes, you didn't have anything to do with it. However, there's so much potential in terms of making societies better if you are engaged. So that's, you know, another framing that I sometimes use when I hear this sense of fear, this sense of, I don't want to engage because I don't feel welcome to engage.
Geeta and Christopher, like a lot of EllisDon, like the programs that you were talking about, the networks within EllisDon sound pretty well developed. And so I'm just wondering, from that perspective, how did you generate buy-in, and more specifically, did you have to make a business case to do DE&I? And if so, how did you do that?
we didn't have to make a business case. I'm pretty honored to work for a corporation that approached me in regards to stepping up and assist in tackling this very important subject matter. In regards to buy-in in particular, buy-in, I'm not going to lie, is a struggle. It's very similar to anything else that we experience outside of this industry or in society as a whole. We are able to do quite a bit of good work with a small number of individuals. I wouldn't say it's volume, it's more about the passion that the people that we've engaged with have in order to resolve the problem.
And just to add to Christopher, we have a CEO who even recently really lives and breathes this stuff. And it's amazing what effect that has on the employees when your leader is presenting in such a way. So just 2 weeks ago, he wrote a memo on our internal portal addressing how important these values are to him as a leader. And if you've ever listened to Jeff Smith, he's a renowned speaker and is so passionate about this. And that call to action that we all embrace this and live this and, you know, take part in the organizations. We have 4 major organizations employee run at EllisDon in various areas, like I was saying, and encouraging all of us to take part. And the buy-in portion, we've now recently addressed our performance review to reflect these values. We've changed our internal, how we evaluate our employees. So are you engaging? Are you being inclusive in meetings? Are you showing up with diversity? Are you allowing others to have a voice? It's so important at EllisDon to be a leader and to show up as leaders in anything, even with our partners. Like being a part here today is so wonderful, right? How we're connecting and sharing our viewpoints to address this and to grow that 1%. So in terms of, you know, connecting into the other panelists, it's about the 1%, catching yourself with your biases. When you did that exercise from Shafiq and you look at, you know, what's coming up when you read those words, those are things that are learned, right? You're not born with these things, you're learned in an environment, and you need to stop and self-correct and challenge yourself to self-correct to see why do I do this, and measure that for yourself. And that's how you bring about the change.
And just staying with you, Geeta and Christopher, how do you engage subtrades? So how do you subtrades, and in general, like it's a construction site, there's multiple different groups of people. Not everyone is your direct employee. So on a construction site, how are you engaging subtrades with respect to DE&I?
So, I mean, I think Christopher could speak to this more. He's a project manager and he lives the sites, but I also, you know, work on a lot of different sites all across EllisDon in my position, and the zero tolerance, like really making that zero tolerance on discrimination, hate crimes. EllisDon, especially, you know, coming out of COVID, was very strict on this is how we treat people. These are the actions. If someone has hate, we will take it as far as we need to. And Jeff Smith, again, was very vocal on that. If there's hate in our industry, he will not tolerate that, and we will press charges and we will move forward, and making people understand that this is our belief. And if you work with us, we need to make sure that there's diversity, inclusion, and love for all. So I think setting that standard and making sure that anyone that you partner with also understands these are the standards.
Yeah, and to kind of echo what Geeta said there, it's about aligning ourselves with our trade partners. So we do work with our trade partners in regards to ensuring that they have DI policies. I evaluate that as part of our bids. It kind of goes towards the awards. I'm lucky enough to work within the institutional sector where our clients also share the same mindset. So they have their own internal initiatives, which I roll onto our projects as well. And on my particular project right now over at U of T Scarborough, we've actually engaged the Toronto District School Board to help onboard some individuals in grade 11 and 12 as well, to get them within the industry on our project. So basically it's all about building up the awareness, showing the representation, and ensuring that our trade partners are aligned.
Thanks, Christopher. We have a question from the chat from Shauna, and it's what's the panel's perspective on the concept of belonging, and how do you think that differs from inclusion? So whoever wants to jump in first, just go ahead.
So I'm not an expert, but when I separate the two, and I recently watched something on this, and what they talked about is showing up as your authentic self at work is belonging, being able to be who you are. So there was a Supreme Court case that went against someone not being able to wear braids at work because they thought it was inappropriate. And this is highlighting not being yourself. Like, what does your hair have to do with your performance and being a team partner at work? And so that's a sense of being able to show up and be authentic, to say who you are, the music you listen to, the food that you eat, and not be discriminated against because of those things that make you who you are, or, you know, naturally you're brought up with it, right? And inclusivity is really different, where it's bringing everyone in groups of people together and making them feel welcomed and, you know, being able to take part in certain things. But belonging is more individual in the sense of being who you authentically are. So being able to respect someone despite maybe an accent, you know, difficulties with speaking or any kind of challenge, or, you know, showing up, looking and being different.
If I may add on top of what Geeta's remarks are, I definitely agree with what you shared, Geeta. And I think that, you know, from my perspective, so beyond being the director of programs of Harmony Movement, I'm also a high school teacher. Christopher, I work in the TDSB actually. I encourage a lot of my students, as many as I can, who it seems to fit for them, to pursue the Ontario Youth Apprenticeship Program. I think it's amazing. But so to say, school communities and work communities are very different, but there's some similarities within any kind of community that you have to attend, like Monday to Friday, right? And essentially what I see is that in school communities in which I've worked in the past, where the students, I have a sense that the students feel like this is my school. Things are, you know, operating in a way that are in a stark contrast to those who are like, I have to go to school. Right. And the difference is that if you feel like this is my school, I belong here, that this is something that, like, you know, I'm a part of in a fundamental way, then I've seen students, you know, avoid littering. I've seen students, you know, break up fights. I've seen students have better respect for the school environment and for one another, but also for like teachers and other parents in the school community. Right. I've seen this sense of ownership that students start to take on. And obviously, you know, there's been different situations outside of working in a educational environment. I've had other positions in which I've noticed a difference when employees kind of drag their feet into the office in the morning versus they feel excited and motivated and engaged and feel like I have a real opportunity to do something in this company that I'm working in. Those differences of our understanding make a huge impact on how we're able to navigate these conversations. Right now, you know, as others have shared, like these policies that are put into place are very important. They need to be there, right? We need a framework to rely on. Things need to be put into text to be able to go back to, right? But we need to go further. And it's not just to say that policies are you know, good and we can leave it there. What it means is that, you know, we can't always approach these conversations simply from like an HR perspective, right? From like a legal frameworks perspective. We really have to dig deeper to understand what's the feelings and what are the motivations of the people involved within that community. If you're engaging in this work, the big question is why? What do you want to see from this, right? Are you doing this to cover yourself, to make sure that nobody calls you out, to make sure that you don't, you know, get called out for being unaccountable? Or are you doing this to actually see these meaningful changes, to be able to build that sense of community and to have all those people, your employees, your coworkers, your managers, your directors, have that sense of ownership over the company, to really feel like this is where I belong. I'm going to make these changes because this is my place.
Yeah. In my opinion, belonging ties into acceptance, but ties into the diversity initiatives that we're doing, right? Because a lot of people, at least from my personal experience and those around me, they do workarounds, right? A lot of people may not complain or voice opinions in regards to their experiences because they're constantly working around in order to provide themselves a sense of false acceptance. And if that's what they're doing, they'll never truly feel that they belong in that situation.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's been a great question. The only thing I'll add is a quote, and I'm probably going to misquote it, but it's the idea that you feel a sense of belonging when you don't have to compromise for the status quo. So I'll leave it there.
I'm gonna maybe not leave it there with you,
Okay.
Chanel, but so I think personally, I think like a lot of organizations, especially in construction, have struggled with incorporating DEI into like different facets of the organization or different files. It's kind of just like out there on its own. And so how do you advise your clients on incorporating it into the overall like organization across departments, make it more of like a strategy as opposed to like a short-term reactive initiative?
Yeah, great question. And I think I'll start with the idea because I think it's so important to emphasize a point that Shafiq just made in terms of starting with the why, right? I think everyone needs to figure that out for themselves. And I really like the slide on, again, the personal, the communal, and the systemic. Depending on who you are, what your role is at the organization, you have an influence, you know, in your work and in those spheres. I like individuals though to start again with the personal. So what's your personal why? And again, you know, how are you modeling the values that you want to see in society, you know, within your workplace? So I think part of it is starting with the why, but then it's also recognizing that the importance of knowing that theory and again, policy needs to move to action. So what, again, on a day-to-day basis, can you be doing? And it could be, you know, I always like to give examples. So, you know, if it is about examining your bias, or again, your default ways of decision-making, you know, think of a way that you can do that. And so sometimes I offer 5 critical questions that you can ask yourself, you know, during a decision-making process, during an information gathering process. And these questions are related to, you know, issues around racial equity, you know, or intersectionality. It could be, you know, depending on what it is, but come up with 5 questions that, you know, that'll help you, again, center equity and help you center inclusion. That's one way. Another suggestion I often put out there is, in terms of building this practice, use tools that you can relate with. So everyone has their own way of studying, for example, or of absorbing information. Some people, when they read a book, they highlight. Some people read it and they might make their own notes, put it in their own words. Some people read it and they debrief with someone. You can use those same strategies to build your anti-racism strategy. You're learning something new. We're learning about new frameworks here. We're learning to ask different questions, examine the biases. We're learning to create, again, to create new ways of doing things. So, you know, I would say, see what the connections are and what you can again do to build your practice, but again, knowing what your tendencies are in terms of change management is huge. So, you know, how can you make it easier? So I hope that helped and gave a few concrete, tangible examples for everyone.
So back to some of the foundation. I mean, all of the panelists here have either have taken training or have been engaged in providing training. And some of RESCON has taken training, and Ahid and I have done a lot, including Shafiq's session. And all of it does have a foundation or a bit of history and theory behind racism and discrimination in Canada and how we got here, why it's an issue. And it also provides, most training does provide some of the theory or definitions. I'll start with Shafiq, but why is that important? So we have heard that, same with the bias, like people saying, okay, are you calling me out by saying that I have biases? We've also heard to the same tune, well, I I already know what racism and discrimination is, so I don't need to be learning more about this, or I know a bit about our history, so why am I hearing this again, or why does this have to be included in part of the training? So can you just talk a bit about why it's still important to be learning about what these definitions mean and kind of the history behind how we came here as a society?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's part of a multi-pronged approach, right? No one approach is going to solve everything. No one approach is going to, have the same kind of impact on a person's learning. And so, there's multiple things that we can do. I think that history component, that framework, that analysis component is definitely important to have in some part of that conversation. Because when we do so, we remind ourselves that it doesn't come down to making simple statements like, I don't see color, or we all bleed red, or these sort of things, right? And I know that those come from a good place. They oftentimes are expressed in a way of saying, I don't see you as less than me, right? I'm not going to discriminate or hate you for your skin color, for example, right? So the motivation is good. However, those statements alone are not going to make the changes that we need, because when we incorporate an understanding of history, we know that this is a process that has been unfolding for centuries, right? And if we, for example, apply that same kind of concept, and let's say, for example, somebody who's Haudenosaunee, right? Oh, I don't see your nationality. What does that mean, right? Like, you're taking away a part of that person's identity, right? Like, there's actual legal frameworks of discrimination in the form of the Indian Act that continue to create a tiered system, an apartheid state within the Canadian society that specifically discriminates against Indigenous peoples, right? And like, that cannot be ignored. So we do need to understand some of these, these histories, right? We need to reference them, because it helps us have a more well-rounded view of these issues. But I will add just one more thing, Amina, and I'll probably come back to this as well, because I'd love to hear the other panelists' perspective on this. But I think with that history, with those frameworks and those definitions, it helps us develop a common language. But I also am really intent on incorporating other parts of those conversations that might not be quite as serious at times, right? I think there's always there's multiple different entry points into this conversation. And this is one thing that working with some construction workers organizations, one of their break rooms, I saw this, and I'm not going to share my screen, but just put this up here. Things that Portuguese and Italians have in common with one another. So as you can imagine, construction industry, sure, a lot of Portuguese and Italian folks in the industry, right? And so some of the things that they listed out here, family comes first. They have no filter and are hot-tempered. They swear a lot. Wooden spoons aren't only used for cooking. They're very stubborn. Goodbyes take forever. Conversations sound like arguments, and so on and so forth, right? So I just kind of shared that piece here. It's just a random one-off thing. It's not like I'm telling them, as doing our harmony workshops, you need to come up with this list, but I noticed it in the break room. And what I noticed is that this tends to create an environment in which we can engage in these conversations, sometimes playfully and sometimes seriously. Right. And I think we need to have a balance of both, because we need to create an environment in which it's okay to talk about these things. Right. It doesn't need to make us feel super tense and closed up and worried and stressed out. Right. We need to create an environment in which we feel comfortable to have those dialogues. If we understand that we have good intentions behind it, then we need to know our history and those definitions and that language, that common language. But once we have some of that down, then we can start to share and to, kind of go beyond that and start to navigate and explore what this means for us in our personal lives. So I think a balance of both is significant.
Does anyone want to add to that?
I think the only thing that I would add to both Shafiq and Chanel, what they've said, is that the problem is not just learning, it's sometimes unlearning. It's unlearning the models and the alternative paradigms that we've created or been taught over time, and trying to step outside of those mental models in order to choose a different one. And so one of the things that go back to Shafiq's point about learning, like the history, is so important, because I went through the Canadian system and a lot of the negative things were not taught. So going outside and going to university and whatnot and really engaging and learning, and especially in my role now where I get to interact with like, you know, members of Indigenous groups and whatnot, you really see a different way. And the importance there is you step outside of your mental mode of what you've been taught or what you know, and you start to see things like, how has this marginalized society, how have the laws and policies and practices separated groups and made it harder for them to be on an equal platform? And so when we start to unlearn, right, we start to then shift our minds into, okay, what's not working? Because history, they say, repeats itself. And so in order to stop it from repeating itself, you have to get to the crux of what is not working so that you can make it change that can work. And so I think it's important when we look back on history and to see what have we done in the past and what changes have we made and what can we do to now shift to do a new change that will work. And so it's important to go back and really learn history and talk about the uncomfortable, the negative things, and really be able not to do the cancel culture, but to allow well-intended people to ask questions if they don't know and feel like it's a safe space and environment, or else people won't ask questions because they're afraid of, you know, getting canceled, fired, just like them being discriminated, like Chanel was saying, right? Almost them turning into the enemy, but really wanting to understand. And so putting a platform where you can have educators teaching things from a standpoint that it's okay to ask questions and it's not silly that you don't know what's happened, because a lot of people don't know what's happened because they weren't in an environment where it was taught.
Yeah, like I can let other people speak to the theory probably much better than I, but in regards to this conversation, I think it's really important to normalize the conversation. I think that's what a lot of people struggle with. And especially when it comes to understanding what has happened in the past, I think a lot of people struggle with the fact that in their minds, they feel that if they accept or acknowledge, or I should say acknowledge the past, it's almost like accepting it, fault for it. And that's not the case whatsoever. Like, we work in an industry where we're really heavy on lessons learned, but when it comes to this, we seem to ignore the lessons learned, just kind of deal with it as an isolated incident, and then simply walk away or look in the other direction. It's kind of like deal with it, hush it, bury it, and then let's move on, but you never actually evolve or learn from it.
And just talking about, I mean, you mentioned the TDSB, how EllisDon has maybe a partnership with TDSB in their OYAP program. Again, I think a lot of us view the work that we're doing on DE&I in isolation and not, or it's like preventing bad things from happening. But I mean, it sounds like there is it certainly is connected to recruitment and retention of the next generation of construction workers. So do you want to talk a bit about that and how, like, again, it is addressing the bad, maybe some of the bad behaviors, but it's also about recruitment and retention, making sure that we're including all to our industry.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about increasing representation within the industry as a whole, right? Because if you allow the representation to stay at the numbers that it currently is at, you're just allowing the unconscious biases and the conversations that aren't taking place to remain in the shadows, right? So it's about shedding the light or shining a light on the circumstances as a whole, increase that representation, and then therefore normalize the conversation, and we can just work together to move forward as a whole, as a society.
And I think this is a good last question from the chat. So it's Miriam. She works for Fremont Homes as a production project manager, and she would like to start talking about DE&I and construction sites and in the head office. In your opinion, and I'll go to all of you, what would be the best way to start?
That's a great question. And I think, you know, it's probably one of the questions I get asked most, you know, where to start, what's the best way to start? How can I do this work in a way that's intentional, and that, you know, you can actually start to build it with good intentions and actually good outcomes. And it's not an easy thing. And for me to answer, you know, lots of this, I'll just say, is context-based. But what I often start with is looking at what are some possible preconditions for success. So definitely you want to kind of look at your existing organizational structure and do a little bit of an assessment yourself to see where are you starting from? Where, again, what are the assets that you have, what's working, and then where are the gaps? So this might include, you know, stuff that we've spoken about before, you know, in terms of where to start, do a bit of an assessment on what is the common language or common understanding related to DEI right now, and kind of map that out. You might want to look at, again, what is the why, and what is the what is the reason for you wanting to, again, either be a leader in this space or to convene these conversations. So again, doing work individually and with your team in terms of the why piece. I think creating an organizational culture with empathy. So again, you know, building on the idea of giving each other grace, giving yourself grace is important. Creating a learning environment. So, and again, exploring what that means. For me, it means mistakes are going to happen and we're going to work through those mistakes. It is a big part of the learning environment, and the growth mindset. Again, we talked about this, the learning and unlearning, and acknowledging that's going to happen. And again, I guess it's just being aware that what we're trying to do is really change minds, mindsets, and hearts, really. I think and that's not easy to do, right? It's behavioral change, it's thinking change. And like we've all acknowledged, we've all, you know, grown up in this system of this legacy of colonization. So it's, you know, I often hold the balance of it's such complex work, but at the same time, through conversations, through learning and listening deeply about the experiences of others, and we do that all the time, you know, we can make change. So it's interesting. Yeah, I often hold those two tensions of complexity, and you know, Sharif mentioned this, but you can also do it, again, make it a day-to-day practice to make it digestible, simple, and again, something that you can engage in.
And Shafiq or Geeta or Christopher?
I would say you would have to kind of acknowledge that you don't have to shoot for the moon right off the hop, right? Like you can make small changes, day-to-day changes within the institution that can actually have rather large ripple effects. So I think a lot of times when you're tackling a subject matter like this, you're looking for that moonshot type of idea, that moonshot initiative, and you kind of get lost there and you forget that I don't have to just kind of jump over this mountain in one leap. You can kind of set up your base camps and kind of go from there. So I would say just make sure that you're aligned with the individuals that are around you. The corporation has to be kind of rowing in the same direction. I know a lot of feedback sometimes comes in as, you know, there's a lot going on all at once, and do we have to do this in such a quick concession? You have to kind of battle those pre-existing mindsets and just kind of chip away at it.
So one of the things I mentioned earlier with Allied in like what I want to accomplish this year is education was my first one. And the second one is connection, right? Connecting often. And one of the things that we do at EllisDon within all of EllisDon, just not our organizations, is that we really highlight all of the like as much festive traditions and cultural days as possible, so people can start to understand, like, what is this group doing? What does this mean? Like, what we don't understand, we try to fill in the blanks. We have newsletters that we talk about diversity and inclusion and what that looks like. Like there's a write-up last month on Ramadan and how is it celebrated. So people, if they don't understand, are gaining the right understanding. And we talk about neurodiversity. What does that mean? And, you know, how do we treat others and how do we be more inclusive? And it's really, there's so many ways to interact now. And I think engaging often and really starting to get to know each other, not as just employees and peer like workers, but also as people. Like, what are you celebrating this month? Like creating things where you can connect often and in a fun way as well, right? Activity-based things are great too. And so a lot of the connection thing, like one of the initiatives with Ally this year is to have people come in and do dances from different heritage so that people can experience the background in a fun way and start to understand, okay, this is music and art, and this is what's tied in. You slowly start to learn the culture from a roundabout way, not always just, from reading and learning in a workshop type way.
And Shafiq, famous last words.
I really appreciate everything that was shared already, and I agree with the other panelists. And even how Chanel started us off, like what a roadmap you gave us just now. And it seems that you're so experienced you could rapid fire those off. But I think if we write those down and come back to them, it's really, really useful. What I will add: don't do this work by yourself. Find others. Find as many others as you possibly can, and move from there. Especially, and to address, Miriam's question about starting off specifically, find those who you might have some sort of agreement with, right? Doesn't mean you agree with everything. You might not be on every single last page 100% of the way, but think about it as like concentric circles or like a ripple effect. Right? You're going to start off and you have certain motivations and ideas. Think about who is in the closest unity with those ideas with you within your organization. It might not be in your department. It might not be the person, across the hall. Maybe you have to go to a different site, whatever it may be, but you need to find those people who have those similar values and those principles and those motivations. You need to sit with those people and have conversations. You need to discuss some of those steps that Chanel had outlined. You need to take into consideration, what are these things that we want to work on changing. Now, Christopher's, don't always shoot for the moon immediately is significant, but I think that we need to know where the moon or where the mountain is, like which direction are we heading in, right? So it's at least good for us to consider that with a tight group of people. Now, if you start off with that, you will be able to, first of all, have a support network. You will be able to incorporate multiple different lived experiences, so you have a better consideration, right? This work is always best done collectively and not in isolation. You will be able to then have this core group of people who have their other connections. So now we're moving outside our smallest circle into the next concentric circle. So think from there, right? Now you have maybe 2 or 3 or 4, maybe you're lucky, you have 5 or 6 people, right? Each one of those people, each one of you can now go and branch out to 2 other people, to 3 other people, right? And think about building consensus, building agreement, thinking about the motivations and the commitment to these values and these principles, and continue to move from there. Once you have that solid core of people, once you work in this collective fashion, you will then be able to navigate all the different obstacles and challenges that you will inevitably encounter. And the last thing I like to leave us off with is just visualize. I really like to visualize a lot of these things that I consider in terms of planning. Visualize, what is your horizon? Where are we headed? What's that mountain? What's that moon? What's that direction that we're going towards? Think about those steps as your road that leads you there. And finally, understand the structure, your organization, your corporation, your department, your business, but mostly those small group of people as your bicycle or as your car, or as whatever vehicle it might be, to help you get there. So you need all those moving parts along the way to be able to understand if you're making that progress, you're going in that direction that you want to do, and always come back to understanding, am I continuing to head in that direction that I want to, and how many people have I met along the way as I'm heading there?
Thanks to the panelists, and I'll just kick it over to Andrew for some final remarks.
Yeah, and in the final remarks, I want to thank Amina and Ahmed and the CARE committee. I think today's event was incredible. I think it was eye-opening. I think it touched on very meaningful topics. So I want to recognize their good work. Also want to thank the speakers and the panelists, so Christopher and Chanel and Shafiq and Geeta. Some of the messages that I heard and listened to today was about implementing. It was about finding where you're at in the process. It was about understanding key themes and allowing for curiosity. I think a big part of this conversation is everybody wants to have the right answer the first day. And I think today made this area more accessible because this is not something that's going to get solved in a day. We need to spend time listening. We need to spend time understanding and talking about biases and allyship and hearing from everybody. And so one message that really jumped out at me, and there was too many to go through, was find where you're at in the process, reach out to your community, reach out to other experts, and start your journey. I do a lot in labor relations and health and safety and labor supply. This issue touches all three. When you go back before 2020, before there was a bigger focus on this, it was never allowed. You were never allowed to be racist on site. It was covered under anti-violence and harassment legislation. It's good that there's a greater focus, and there will continue to be a greater focus under health and safety. And I think we need to commend the leadership of Dr. Joel Moody and the Chief Prevention Officer, as well as the Ministry of Labor. But there's groups like IHSA as well that are dedicating resources to this, and they're there to help contractors and people in construction as well. When you look at labor supply, we need more people in construction. That means we just need to be more welcoming. We need to do a better job with these issues. We need better onboarding. Anti-racism is a labor supply issue. And you don't want to just focus on health and labor supply. People should do this for the right reasons. You're going to see this more in labor law. You're going to see this more in a labor relations setting. So there's motivation to do it too. But I really believe that what we talked about here really is going to touch and impact everything: recruitment, retention, onboarding. So the work done today and the concepts brought up hopefully will translate into the construction industry and allow and encourage some of the discussions that need to be done. And so thank you to everybody here today. Thank you for the CARE committee. And I think the last thing I'll say is, this is not a topic for today, it's a topic for every day. And so let's use what we heard today and learned today and carry it forward. I think somebody said 1% at a time. So with that, I'll end it there.